Welcome in, everyone. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator, the Week 14 Start Sit Show. I've got some underdog fantasy high-low picks for you. We've almost made it. We are now officially 1 week away from the fantasy playoffs. We've got 6 teams on bye. The challenges never stop. The fight never ends. I'm excited. Let's get right down to it. Starting at the quarterback position, I am starting Russell Wilson this week. Fantasy Pros has him as the consensus quarterback 12 against the Browns. So, yeah. Against the Browns 2 weeks ago in week 12, 14 fantasy points. But Russell Wilson did have 270 passing yards. He just happened to only have 1 passing touchdown. With Jameis Winston on the other end, there's always upside and potential for a shootout. So to begin with, the Cleveland Browns pass defense has underwhelmed all year. Jameis Winston now has racked up 5 starts as a Cleveland Brown this season. Opposing quarterbacks have at least 248 passing yards in all 5 games. Opposing quarterbacks are actually averaging 277 passing yards per game against the Browns when Jameis Winston's at quarterback. Essentially, you're pretty much signing up for shootout conditions with Jameis Winston on the other end. And I really like Russell Wilson this week, especially with 6 teams on bye. Stream Will Levis. Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 15 on the week against the Jaguars. Jaguars are the best possible matchup for opposing quarterbacks in fantasy football. Quarterbacks against the Jaguars average more than 5 fantasy points above their season average. So Will Levis, he's technically averaging about 14 fantasy points per game in his full starts this year. So 14 plus 5 is 19. I'm not saying he's definitely mandatorily guaranteed legally going to score 19 fantasy points, but the math does say that it's a pretty good matchup, purely just looking at Jacksonville on the other side. And then you look, and since returning from injury, Levis has played 4 games, and he has at least 16 fantasy points in all of them. He's going to give you a pretty decent floor if your quarterback is on bye this week. One more streamer, it's Jameis Winston. You probably guessed it. The consensus quarterback 17 at the Steelers, that is simply too low considering his upside. He's averaging nearly 23 fantasy points per game as a starter. He's leading the NFL. I actually tweeted about this last week at JLarky Tweets on Twitter, at Josh Larky, Blue Sky. I tweeted, how hilarious is it that Joe Flacco plays 5 games for the Browns last year and he leads the NFL in passing yards per game. And now we have Jameis Winston, 5 games for the Browns, currently leading the NFL with 336 passing yards per game. Pretty much the limiting factor with the Browns the past 2 years has been Deshaun Watson. Now, the Steelers, it's a tough defense. But if you are projected to lose your weekly matchup, Jameis Winston always has that 25 to 30 fantasy point upside. You might as well plug him in and see what happens. Turning to the running back position, start DeAndre Swift, the consensus running back 21 at the 49ers. I am recording this on Friday morning. As of right now, DeAndre Swift did not practice on Wednesday or Thursday with a quad injury. But I think it is worth noting that Wednesday and Thursday, DJ Moore has also not practiced with a quad injury. There is, I think, a decent chance this is a placeholder injury and that it's basically just a rest days for 2 veterans, DeAndre Swift, DJ Moore. I think Swift plays as of right now. If I am wrong, that's fine. You just simply will not play him if he doesn't play. It's easy. But if he does, if he's active, I'm very interested. Now, Roschon Johnson, the backup, he's concussed right now. He might not play. He'd been eating a little bit into DeAndre Swift's workload. And right now, we've got a great matchup at the 49ers. The 49ers, when you adjust for running backs faced, they are the 5th best matchup for fantasy points. The 5th best matchup. Running backs are averaging 3 fantasy points above expectation against the Niners. So the running back room overall, 3 points above expectation. Roschon Johnson doesn't play. All that work goes to DeAndre Swift. You could be looking at a several fantasy point bump just based on the matchup. Now, the last 2 games, they faced the Lions, the Vikings. Those are both bottom 3 matchups for fantasy points to running backs. So we go from the bottom 3 matchup there to a top 5 matchup. Now, it couldn't be more different for DeAndre Swift. I like him even if Roschon Johnson plays, but there's 6 teams on bye. But if Roschon sits this week, DeAndre Swift is a fringe fantasy RB1. Start Breece Hall. I couldn't believe this. I had to wipe the eye crust away as I was looking at the rankings. I was like, what? Huh? Breece Hall? Consensus running back 19 this week at the Dolphins. Dolphins are the 7th best matchup for running backs. Breece Hall had 12 carries last week. Braylon Allen was second on the team, not with 12, with 5. Decent difference. So it was frustrating. Breece Hall did not catch any passes last week. And then we see Braylon Allen and the other rookie running back, Isaiah Davis, combined for 5 catches, 44 yards, and a touchdown through the air last week, receiving 5 catches, 44 receiving yards, 1 touchdown. None of that went to Breece Hall. But Breece Hall ran 22 routes in the passing game. Braylon Allen ran 11. Isaiah Davis ran 8. It was actually quite good usage for Breece Hall, who dominated the carries. He dominated the routes overall. And he just didn't happen to have box score stats. We know the kind of receiver he is out of the backfield. I'm not concerned. It's a good matchup. It's a division rival this week. I think Breece Hall is a top 12 back this week. I know the floor is going to be a little bit lower, but 6 teams on bye. I don't know anyone out there that would have Breece Hall and would sit him. I'm more just like, come on, let's be gung-ho about this. Breece Hall, top 12 running back this week. At the receiver position, start Jaxon Smith-Njigba. He's becoming pretty much an every week start. He's got a great matchup, though. He's the consensus wide receiver 17 at the Cardinals. Cardinals are the 4th best matchup for slot-specific receivers this year. Jaxon Smith-Njigba plays almost entirely out of the slot. He's been turning into the Seahawks' most consistent receiver this year. The past 5 games, he's really broken out fully. He's averaging 8.5 targets, 6.5 receptions, over 100 yards, and 21 fantasy points per game over that 5-game stretch. He has fully arrived. He's pretty much each and every week fantasy wide receiver 1 type with his usage. Another one for you, another young receiver, Ladd McConkey. Consensus wide receiver 19 at the Chiefs. Start him. He's a guy that keeps showing up on this podcast because Ladd McConkey keeps producing. Yet every week he's somehow underrated. The Chiefs look like an average matchup for fantasy receivers. You log into your ESPN, your Yahoo, your Sleeper fantasy app, and you go, oh, Chiefs. And it probably says something like 15, 16. And you think, oh, okay, it's average. But this is why I'm here. This is why you listen to the show. The Chiefs are actually the 5th best matchup for slot receivers when you adjust for quality of opponents faced. And I'm just looking at receivers. And I will say this, it's better than 5th best. And you might be like, Josh, what the hell do you mean? Well, I'm not even counting non-receivers who basically play receiver. I'm looking at players who are wide receivers in fantasy. Brock Bowers is essentially the Raiders slot receiver. And I didn't even count Brock Bowers in this. And Bowers had 14 targets, 10 catches, 140 yards, and a touchdown last week against the Chiefs. I'm telling you, the Chiefs are beatable in the slot. Ladd McConkey, strong start. He's already been a limited practice participant this week. He should play. And you should play Darnell Mooney. Consensus wide receiver 31 at the Vikings. Now, the Vikings are the best overall matchup for fantasy wide receivers this year. Darnell Mooney splits with Drake London between the slot and the outside. They shift them around the formation, kind of 50-50. Regardless of deployment, it's an extremely favorable matchup. I have Darnell Mooney in the low-end fantasy wide receiver 2 tier this week. I might need to bump him up. My fantasy rankings are free on Twitter, at JLarkyTweets, on Blue Sky, at Josh Larky. That's it. There are 2 places. Maybe we can add a third. If anyone out there does graphics and wants to make an Instagram graphic for the kids love the Instagram graphics. Or if you want to make a TikTok, I don't know how we would make a TikTok with fantasy rankings. Hit me up. Let's discuss. Now this one, It's already gotten controversy. I've talked to a few people about this. I've bounced this take off of them. It's been hit miss. I think it's going to be a hit. I'll tell you, the good people, publicly. Amari Cooper, I think you should start him this week. He's the consensus wide receiver 38 at the Rams. He is the biggest difference between consensus and my rankings. I have Amari Cooper not as the wide receiver 38 in my current fantasy rankings. I have him at wide receiver 24 this week. The Rams are the 8th best matchup for outside receivers. It's a great matchup. They've been shutting down the slot this year. That's really where the Rams have succeeded. Now we've got the dome game in Los Angeles, so there's no weather concerns like the Bills game last week. The game total is 49.5, so around 50 points. Second highest of the week. Vegas projects a lot of scoring and a lot of touchdowns from both these teams. This is Amari Cooper week. And if you're extremely desperate, stick with the same team. Keon Coleman, wide receiver 58 by consensus at the Rams. As I mentioned, the Rams struggle on the outside. Keon Coleman should return this week. Coleman had back-to-back games of 7 targets and at least 70 yards before getting injured in week 9. And he's a solid dart throw if you need one. And I'm not really going to talk about Khalil Shakir too much. I wouldn't say that he's in the full-blown sit category this week. I like the game environment. It's in a dome. But if I had to choose out of the big 3 Bills receivers, which one would underperform this week, I'd lean Khalil Shakir. You're probably still starting him. I mean, come on. There's 6 teams on bye. But I do like the outside matchups for these Bills receivers better. Before we get to tight ends, before we get to sits, before we get to underdog fantasy picks, a question in the chat. Better bench pickup, Zach Charbonnet or Sincere McCormick PPR? That's a great question. And the reason that I wanted to tackle that is because it depends on your roster. If you need an RB2 this week, I think Sincere McCormick might lead this backfield for the Raiders in carries like he did last week. He looked good last week. They elevated him from the practice squad. They officially signed him to the active roster. But it's Sincere McCormick. It's the Raiders. If you are not planning to start this player this week, Zach Charbonnet is the far better bench stash. Anything happens to Kenneth Walker, you have a top 5 fantasy running back on your hands. So it just depends what your team needs. Need a running back this week? Sincere McCormick. Need a bench stash for the fantasy playoffs? Zach Charbonnet. Tight end. Start Will Dissly. Consensus tight end 12 at the Chiefs. Chiefs are the 2nd best matchup for tight ends in fantasy. Tight ends average 3.5 fantasy points above expectation against the Chiefs when you adjust for opponents. Will Dissly had 1 target. He did not catch his target last week. It reminds me last night of Jaden Reed. And you go, oh, that matchup's perfect. Detroit's been struggling against the slot. Jaden Reed, 1 target, no catches. That is what we saw from Will Dissly the week before. Sometimes you have to fight, as the Podfather always says, you got to fight the fantasy PTSD. If we look at last week in that Chargers-Falcons game, Ladd McConkey had 9 catches and 117 yards. No Chargers player, aside from McConkey, had more than 12 receiving yards. It was a weird game. Prior to that, in the 6 games prior to that, Dissly had been averaging over 6 targets, 5 catches, 48 yards. Those are solid numbers. It's a great matchup. I am actually firing up Dissly. Yeah, I'm firing up in a couple leagues myself. And if you need desperation streamers, I think Jake Ferguson, Cowboys, interesting. And we can go even deeper. He should play. He's been practicing this week. It'd be Dalton Kincaid. We're going right back to that Bills game. I'm just really bullish on this Bills-Rams game. I think there can be a lot of fantasy points scored. Kincaid's currently the consensus tight end 28 at the Rams. That'll go up, I think, as rankers realize he's going to play this week. He was limited in practice beginning Wednesday this week, so he should return in week 14 if he's going to practice Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. The Bills team total is 4th highest, so there's the touchdown upside. Vegas projects 26.5 points from them. The high game total, as I mentioned. We like touchdown upside with our tight ends. And I know that Kincaid's been disappointing all year. I get it. But I'm actually starting him in 2 leagues myself because it's week 14. There's 6 teams on bye. What are we going to do, folks? Sometimes you got to start a Dalton Kincaid. He's been disappointing. this is his week.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you win 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins-Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Promo code Underworld. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. Week 14 starts and sits and Underdog fantasy picks. All right, we got through the starts. Let's talk about some sits. At quarterback, I see a lot of people. I'm in dozens of leagues. I see a lot of my opponents starting Brock Purdy this week against the Bears. And I think that's mistaken. I understand you want to start Purdy with the bye weeks, but against the Bears, it's the 4th worst matchup. Fantasy quarterbacks are averaging nearly 3 fantasy points per game lower than their season average when they face the Bears. No Christian McCaffrey probably hurts. Star offensive tackle Trent Williams didn't practice Wednesday or Thursday this week with his ankle injury. I would simply rather start Will Levis or Jameis Winston this week than Brock Purdy. But consensus tells me that's wrong. I'm going out on a limb. I'm going to say it's right. We will find out on Sunday how that ages. Running back. I had him as a start last week. Rico Dowdle. He is now in the sit category because Rico Dowdle is not facing the Giants. He is facing the Bengals. He is the consensus running back 16 on the week. That sounds too bullish. Dowdle's ranking this week, I believe it's an overcorrection to that dream Thanksgiving matchup. Dowdle had 22 carries, 112 rushing yards, and a touchdown. He caught 3 passes for 11 yards against the Giants. It was an easy win. 20 fantasy points. Beautiful, beautiful. We like that. But this week, the Cowboys are 5.5 point underdogs against the Bengals. Another likely bad game script for Dowdle. We've seen what happens when the game script is really bad. He simply doesn't get carries. We'll actually talk about him more again shortly with some Underdog fantasy picks. But the Bengals are much tougher against the run than the pass. The points last week were great. You started Dowdle. You're happy with it. Time to lower expectations. I think he probably gets you 7 to 10 fantasy points in week 14. If that's what you need or that's what you want, you have nothing else, great, start Dowdle. Based on where you drafted him in fantasy as a late round 10, 11, 12, 13 pick in your fantasy league, good chance you do have 2 better options this week. And then another sit. Another guy that you drafted late and you've been banking points week after week would be Chuba Hubbard. I am sitting him. Consensus running back 22 at the Eagles. Now, the Eagles, the matchup is bad. 4th worst matchup for fantasy running backs when you adjust for opponents. It's bad. And we just saw Jonathan Brooks' role increase in his second game. So week 12, Jonathan Brooks makes his NFL debut. The long awaited debut. He makes his debut. He has 2 carries for 7 yards. But then last week, in his second game, Brooks had 6 carries. Chuba had 12. So already he goes from a non-factor to suddenly like, oh, he's actually getting some real work. And then Chuba didn't catch any passes. Jonathan Brooks had 3 catches for 23 yards in the receiving game. We could see the role increase further. It could become more of a committee for the offense Vegas projects for 16 points. That is it. 16.5 points projected for the Panthers. That is the lowest of week 14. I am not interested in Chuba Hubbard. I think the floor is terrifying. It's looking like he's a 1A potential committee back this week with a terrible game script. We'll talk about him more shortly with some Underdog picks as well. And then at receiver, I am trending towards Juwan Jennings. Sit. Consensus wide receiver 25 versus the Bears. I don't really like Purdy. I don't really like Juwan Jennings. Bears are the second worst matchup for fantasy receivers this year when you adjust for opponent's face. They faced kind of a litany of receivers, and when you look, they've generally just been underperforming expectation. The 49ers, they are on the decline. It's a lost season. Christian McCaffrey's out. I think they could just get Deebo Samuel going in the run game, maybe the quick passing game. I think Juwan Jennings, could he hit? Of course, it's the Niners. We could always see one or two players erupt for big games. But I think the floor this week for Jennings is really, really low. I have no strong feelings about tight end sits this week. Twitter @JLarky tweets. Check out my fantasy rankings and my matchups so you can see every tight end in their matchups if you want to know more. I'm not super confident about any of these as sits. I've got 3 underdog fantasy picks for you, and then we'll get you out of here on this Friday morning. The first, we've got a higher, Will Levis, higher, 209.5 passing yards. The last 3 games, he's had over 209.5 yards, 295, 278, 212. He gets the elite matchup against the Jaguars. I think Levis is going to get you 225 to 250 yards on Sunday. Rico Dowdle, lower, 87.5 total yards. Dowdle is just 1-5 on the over. So basically 83% of the time that the Cowboys have lost and Dowdle played, he was under this number. The Cowboys are 5.5-point underdogs against the Bengals. In the 6 losses that Rico Dowdle played in, he has not gone over 12 carries in any of them. Like I said earlier, he's game script dependent. The Bengals are a pass funnel defense. 87.5, that's a lot of yards. And then Chuba Hubbard, lower, 76.5 total yards. Jonathan Brooks cuts into his carries and receiving role more in week 13 than in week 12. I think he does it more in week 14 than week 13 than week 12. I think it's a gradual increase for Jonathan Brooks and his usage. The Eagles are 12.5-point favorites. That is nearly a full touchdown farther apart in the spread than any other week 14 game. Game script is almost certainly not in Chuba Hubbard's favor. There's the chances roll decreases further. 76.5 total yards is just too many. I'm not confident he gets the pass game work. I'm not confident the Panthers are able to run much against this Eagles defense, even if they want to. Those are your 3 picks. We've got someone in the chat. Jameis Winston, Wilson. Wow, I almost said Russell Winston. Jameis Winston, Russell Wilson, Justin Herbert in the chat. My fantasy rankings are free on Twitter @JLarky tweets. Right now, I have Russell Wilson ranked the highest. I'm the most confident currently about that matchup. But stay tuned. Things can change. I'm Josh Larky. This was week 14. Starts, sits, underdog, fantasy, picks. The Dominator, Player Profiler, Underdog Fantasy, promo code Underworld. The sponsors are happy. They heard what they needed to hear. I'll be back next week for the fantasy playoffs. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.